Thank you so much for your fantastic presentation, Mr. Bùi Tuấn Minh. Ladies and gentlemen, let's continue our conference with the presentation of Mr. Aaron Soar, Head of Corporate Reporting inside Financial ACCA Global, with the topic Reporting R&D, Reporting of R&D, Disclosure Without Recognitions.
Kính thưa quý vị, sau đây hội thảo của chúng ta sẽ tiếp tục với phần trình bày của ông Aaron Soar, Giám đốc chuyên môn về báo cáo tài chính doanh nghiệp, Hiệp hội Kế toán Công chứng Anh Quốc, với chủ đề Báo cáo về nghiên cứu và phát triển, công bố thông tin mà không ghi nhận. Xin trọng kính mời ông.
So hello and good morning, everyone. Good morning to the distinguished guests, to professors, to all students, and ladies and gentlemen. I am Aaron Soar from ACCA, and I'm a fellow member of ACCA as well. So let's look at, before that, I would like to thank the Academy of Finance for inviting ACCA to share some insights from our recent research on R&D. Now, as you know, research and development, or R&D, may create new value for the business or sustain existing ones. It may create new products, new services, gain you new customers or new relationships, and bring on new capital in the form of financial capital to the organization, right, or to the company. Now, given the importance of R&D, naturally, stakeholders would value information about an organization's R&D. What does it do to its business model, and what kind of impact the R&D may generate? However, despite the importance of R&D, and as the title for today's session suggests, there are companies that gives the impression they have made disclosures about R&D without recognizing any R&D related expenditure in the financial statements. So this research was conducted by ACCA and the Adam Smith Business School of University of Glasgow to find out why. Why do companies put in so much effort in the narrative reporting, but do not disclose the expenditure involved? So from the research that we have done, we found that over half of all sample organizations are R&D inactive. Before we proceed, you will hear me say this term a lot, R&D inactive. Now, for the purpose of this research, organizations that do not separately disclose or do not separately report R&D asset or an R&D expense in the financial statements are classified as R&D inactive. So on the contrary, companies that do report separately an R&D asset or R&D expense will be classified as R&D active. And we come to this conclusion after looking at over 70,000 samples of financial data from listed organizations. Yes, we only look at listed companies in 40 countries around the world for a period of 5 years. That is from 2017 to 2021. This may seem shocking at first. However, this is not the first of our research. This is actually a part of a series of research that we've been looking at intangibles. And we found that this has been the case even in our earlier research. But what we want to know is that, do companies that do not separately report R&D asset or expense talk about R&D in their annual reports? Well, the finding is really interesting. But before that, at this point, you may wonder, hey, Aaron, would companies switch? Can they turn from being R&D inactive to R&D active, or vice versa? Well, we found that nearly half of all sample organizations had never been R&D active in the 5 years under review. a small proportion of them do switch, right? And you can see there's 9% of them that switch between one category to another. And when we dive in deeper to look at the data and see, so what's the proportion of them that switch from being, say, R&D inactive to active? How many of them become active? Only a small 1%. Only 1% of all our samples switch from being inactive to active. On the other hand, about 2% switch from being R&D active to being R&D inactive. So it begs, I mean, when we look at the annual reports of these companies, it really begs the question, are these organizations genuinely R&D inactive? So we narrowed down from over 70 samples, we narrowed down to about 12,000 annual reports. And from there, we look at the use of R&D terms in the annual report. For this purpose, we have a benchmark list of 149 R&D terms, and we've checked these annual reports against these 149 terms, and we found a range of terms being used, a range of frequencies. Some annual reports have higher frequencies, some have lower, and we also classified them. Where do they appear? Do they appear in the financial statements of the company, or do they appear in the narratives? Now, the narratives is used to describe sections outside of the financial statements. This could be, some call it as management commentary, management analysis, management discussion, or simply narrative reporting, sustainability reporting. So any reporting in the annual report that is outside financial statements are called narratives for the purpose of this research. And we've classified these disclosures, the frequency of use of R&D terms, as minimal, low, and high. On its own, it doesn't mean much. But when we cross-tabulate our observation, things get very, very interesting. Now, I'm going to point your attention to this cell here, which represents about 17% of the total samples of annual reports. It shows that about 17% of the annual reports have a high volume of R&D terms being used in both its financial statements and in the narratives. What does this mean? Now, firstly, the companies do not disclose their expenditure involved, but at the same time, they use a high frequency of R&D terms. So are these organizations genuinely R&D inactive? On the other hand, all right, in this cell, there are organizations that do not disclose the R&D expenditure, but at the same time, they only use a minimal number of R&D terms. Perhaps it's not even talking about R&D, but some terms have similarity, right? Or they may be used for other purpose. And therefore, these are those with minimal disclosures. What's the importance of these observations? Like, why should we care? Now, annual reports are supposed to explain to users what the entity has done or what it is doing, right? So if an annual report is giving disconnected information, it can be confusing. It does not help users in making decision, or what we say is not decision useful. So what do we mean by high frequency, minimal frequency? Let's look at this. Assuming you pick up an annual report and flip through it and you find, oh, there's a lot of R&D terms being used. Talk about research, talk about development, they talk about innovation. And from what we've gathered, the mean, right, the mean frequency of R&D terms being used in the entire annual report is 34. is for those that classify as high disclosure. In comparison, when we look at the mean frequency for all annual reports, now this shows you why they are high. It's almost double. The mean is almost double the mean for all annual reports. At the same time, you can see a very similar pattern for disclosures in the narratives and in the financial statements of those that we've classified as high disclosures. The number is almost double of that for all annual reports. And there's another very interesting pattern that you can see here, is that organizations tend to use more R&D terms in the narratives, the middle column, in the narratives than in the financial statements. Okay, so hold that thought in mind. There is a very significant finding, which I'll talk through later. But now I want to show you those that are minimal disclosures. Why we'll say perhaps they are really R&D inactive? Because firstly, there's no expenditure related to R&D being disclosed. And secondly, the use of R&D terms is so low. It's only 2 in the entire annual report. I mean, that's the mean figure. Now, looking at the frequency of R&D terms can tell us something. It gives us an indication of whether this company has they done any R&D or not. And if the mean is, say, 15, that indicates there are some annual reports with lower frequency and there are some with a much higher frequency, right? And I'll show it to you. Yes, in fact, some of the annual reports recorded, I don't know, it's amazingly high number of R&D. It goes up as high as 606 R&D terms being used in the annual report, while this company did not disclose any R&D expenditure. So no asset, no R&D asset, no R&D expense, but it used up to 606 R&D terms. And it also tells us one thing, that if these companies are R&D and inactive, why do they disclose R&D terms that are almost as high as those R&D active peers? So this column shows a comparison. When we compare it against companies that are R&D active, companies that disclose R&D assets and expenses, this is the mean frequency in their annual reports, mean in narratives and financial statements. And immediately, what comes to mind is that they are not that different, right? Yes, they are different, but it's not much higher. So that indicates that some of these R&D inactive organizations are reporting a high volume of R&D related terms. Why is this important? So go back to the example earlier that I asked you, if you were flipping through annual reports, say 200 pages, right? Some annual reports are really thick, 200 pages, and you see over 100 times of R&D terms being used. And then you want to find out, okay, they tell me so much about their R&D project. How much are they spending? How much are they spending on this project? You try to find, but you can't see the number. So obviously, you may question, serious or not? Are you serious? How can you be doing this R&D project without spending any money? Or on the other hand, if you're an investor, right, you may wonder, how serious is this organization in the R&D that they are telling me in the annual reports? Hence, we have to think about, why are these findings important? An organization has to consider carefully what it says or what it does not say about its R&D in the annual report, because the narratives that they put forward could influence stakeholders' perception about its future prospects. Prospects like its growth opportunities, prospects about its going concern, about its future. Would it continue to operate in the next 10 years, 20 years, especially in our fast changing environment? Okay, so in our research, we look at a few stakeholders. For today, I've only selected a few. Firstly, we'll look at investors. Investors would consider how will this organization exist in the long term if things continue to change. Imagine you have a product that has never changed for the past 20 years. Would it continue to exist? Will customers continue to buy this product for the next 20 years? And so naturally, the next question is, should I invest in this company? So to help us understand these questions, we also look at some statistics related to organizations, and I've put in a few. I'll highlight the first one, which is really interesting. Book to market ratio. What we've seen is that these are the mean numbers, again, the mean book to market ratio. The mean for R&D inactive company is higher than the mean for R&D active. What this indicates is that a higher book to market ratio tells us that the share value of the organization is closer to its book value. And that indicates investors' perception about the organization's growth opportunities. So if an organization has higher growth opportunities, they may ascribe a higher share value to it. In contrast, if not, then the share value will be closer to the book value. And that would have other effects, and perhaps it has impacted organizations' capital structure. So the next thing we observe is that R&D inactive companies tend to be financed using debt more than equity. As you can see from the proportion of debt in the capital structure is higher than those of their R&D active peers. Almost 85% is coming from debt instrument. And another thing that we notice, why would this happen, right? Perhaps it has something to do with the type of, with their ownership. And true enough, we found that R&D inactive companies are also, they tend to be closely held, closely owned by a small group of investors. Now, perhaps these three factors impact each other. You can't raise that much capital, so you rely on that, and therefore you may have a smaller group of investors. So why is this finding important? If the company is trying to raise capital in the equity market, then it better be disclosing its R&D expenditure, especially if there is really R&D activities. Now, let's talk about another stakeholders. What about the National Statistics Department? If they have been collating information from annual reports, right, looking at the company's R&D expenditure, and it says nil, nothing, I cannot find anything. But at the same time, so much disclosure. So for the National Statistics Department and anyone using the statistic, is the statistics accurate? So a single company's disclosure could have a larger impact when the data is aggregated. Also, this finding will be very relevant to our audience today, who will be joining the workforce soon if you're not already in the workforce. As you know, R&D may also influence employees' perception of the companies. Now, in fact, from one of our recent survey that was published as the Global Talent Trends 2023, we found the number one factor attracting talent to an organization is career development or learning and growth opportunities. Growth opportunities only comes when the organization is on a growth trajectory, is growing, right? So if employees or prospective employees do not feel or do not see the companies growing, they would have questions like, should I join this company? Or if you're already in the organization, you may think, should I stay or should I go? Or should I join another entity that is growing, that has more innovation? So it will have impact on the organization's talent attraction. Now that we've understand what's the importance of disclosure, or what's the how has this disclosure influenced the company, I'm sure you would like to know what's inhibiting the separate disclosure in the financial statements. What's so difficult, right? So there's only so much that quantitative data can tell us. To help us understand what's inhibiting these separate disclosures, we gathered qualitative data. We reached out to a group of preparers, auditors, and policymakers. Also, there was a standard setters. So we showed them these findings and asked for their opinions and asked for their views. What do they think are inhibiting separate disclosures? And what we found, I've categorized them into two buckets. First bucket is, you will see here, they are technical related, or I will call them technical related. Firstly, what's so difficult? What are the reasons inhibiting disclosures? Firstly, there's ambiguity over what constitutes R&D in the contemporary economy. Say an organization was doing a research on how they could expand the customer base, but then they struggle. Is this activity considered R&D in the standards? Well, if not, then they will not be able to classify and account for it as R&D. Secondly, is difficulty in applying materiality by nature in disclosure. Now, I have to elaborate this a little. R&D happens in iterative processes. It may take time. So at some point, the amount of expenditure may be smaller relative to other assets or liabilities, and therefore the company may think that it is immaterial. However, if you consider the other component of materiality, which is the nature of the transaction, would it influence decision making? Now, I've shown you the data earlier, so you would have an inkling. If it would influence decision making of users, then yes, this information is material, even though the amount may be relatively smaller. And thirdly, is an absence of explicit requirements for disclosing qualitative information about R&D. The absence of requirement does not mean that companies say, no requirement, don't need to disclose. What happened was that without explicit requirements, companies then use their own discretion in making disclosures, in providing the disclosures about the nature and the extent of information in the annual reports. And therefore, this would have contributed to our observations. So much R&D descriptive disclosures, but no amount. Now, I will talk about the second bucket here, which is, I categorize them as operations and financial related. So the first reason is the lack of incentives. Now, it's just like, I know if we do something, we try to understand the purpose. What's the objective? What's the purpose of doing it? The same happens to company. If the company do not see any benefits of classifying or reclassifying the expenses, they will not do it. What this means is, I give you an example. Let's say an organization is doing a research, and involved in the research is there are, say, 3 engineers. They use some materials, they're testing on the materials, and they use electricity, right? So there will be salary, material costs, and utility costs. Now, if the companies do not see any benefits in categorizing these expenses as R&D, they will still be recognized, but it will appear as employee benefits, utility costs, and materials costs. That's it, but not R&D costs, and therefore you do not see R&D expenditure. Another possible reason is the corporate culture. If the organization is very concerned about commercial sensitivity of its R&D activities, then they may not want to disclose so much, right? Much less about how much I'm spending on this R&D, just in case my competitor is also copying what I'm doing. And the last point is related to organization funding requirements. So if an organization is raising funds, it needs more equity capital, they tend to disclose more. They tend to tell investors where they are putting their money in R&D, where they are spending that money. But on the contrary, if they are not looking for new funds, then they may not do it. So all in all, to sum up, what does all these findings mean? And that's really part of our jobs and ACCA professional insights. Doing research is one thing. The next important step is sharing with our audience what does all these findings mean and how can you use it in your day-to-day jobs and your day-to-day life. Well, we found that our findings collectively point towards fundamental problems in reporting R&D. To sum up, firstly, if an organization do not see R&D activity as R&D in the standards, and in this case, EIS 38, then the associated cost will not be reported R&D expenditure. On the other hand, the cost will be reported according to the underlying nature, and therefore, we do not see any R&D expenditure, albeit that there's a high volume of R&D terms being used in the reporting. Secondly, is in contrary to the first point, is this R&D expenditure may be recognized. They may have been recognized as expense or recognized as R&D asset, but the amount is not reported separately. Again, this may be due to materiality, and therefore we do not see R&D expenditure. And lastly is disconnected disclosures that indicate investment in R&D. You can see in the narratives, but users are not able to tell how much a company has spent or is spending on its R&D. Then this disconnected information is not decision useful, or worse, it could be confusing to users. So, what do we do with this? Of course, Aaron, you tell me all the problem. What can we do? What should we do to resolve it? Now, in the spirit of research, I won't be sharing all the recommendations. In fact, I would strongly recommend you to reach out, to download the reports and look at the recommendations, and then assess whether you agree or do not agree with these recommendations. To resolve the fundamental problems that we found, we think 5 stakeholder groups needs to be involved. They are the professional accountants and the organizations that they serve, those charged with governance, the auditors who are auditing the organization's annual reports, and fourth are the standard setters and the policymakers who have the power to amend the standards to bring them up to date or to issue new application guidance or provide examples. And lastly is the user group. Users comprise investors, suppliers, customers, even employees, those who have the power to query management on their disclosures if there's conflicting disclosures, and they can do this via available channels like Investor Relations Department. So with that, I will wrap up my presentation, and I can take a few questions if there's time.
All right. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation, Mr. Aaron. So now let's move on to the Q&A part for our 2 keynote speakers in our conference today. So the first question, I really want to know if anyone has any questions for Mr. Aaron Soar here. Please raise your hand and let us know. Is there anyone have the question? All right, you please.
So good morning. Hello, Mr. Aaron Saw. So my name is Do Anh Cha. I am a student from a dual degree program from Academy of Finance. So I must say that I am very attracted by your presentation, and so I have a very small issue that need you to clarify. So my question is that how does the differentiation of reporting R&D access and R&D expenses increase transparency and financial accountability of the company through shareholders and investors? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question, Doing. And that's also the reason why we conducted this research. In fact, one of our earlier research was looking at the capitalization of R&D. Do companies capitalize or do they expense their R&D expenditure? And we found that companies tend to expand rather than capitalize, and there were some challenges that we found in that report, in that research, and so that got us thinking. Now, if companies expand their expenditure, on one hand, users of financial reports will find, okay, so would it generate future value? You have expand. And the other thing is, how much have you incurred cumulatively on this research project? Currently, they will not be able to know because it's only annual expenditure that is being reported. So that got us into doing this research, and we want to find out if, let's say, companies do not disclose their R&D expenditure, but they talk about it. Would it impact them? Would it have any impact, right? So if there's no impact, what's the point of being transparent? What's the point of telling users how much I spend, how much the company is spending on R&D? Now, the impact that we found is something I shared earlier, is that it influences the share value of the organization. Share value comes, one of the components of share value is the expectation, investors' expectation of the growth opportunities, company's growth opportunities, right? So you hear terms like multiple PEs, how many times investors are willing to spend to give you that multiples PEs. And so so what we found is that investors provide a higher share value to organizations that disclose their R&D asset or expenditure. Now, it doesn't matter whether they capitalize or not, so long as they disclose the expenditure, these organizations tend to have a higher share value compared to those organizations that do not. So firstly, it tells you there's impact on share value. And secondly, it impacts on their capital structure, right? Now, if you need funds, if a company needs funds and they cannot raise capital through equity, the next best option is debt instruments. They have to take borrowings. So some may say borrowings is more costly. They will have a higher cost of capital compared to equity. And therefore, again, that's a price. That's the price for transparency. Okay. I think I'll stop there because the next point I will bring up is about the employees, attraction of talent that I've gone through earlier.